The metal bucket rolled across the sidewalk, splattering red paint onto the snow. 3 men stood over the old janitor, their voices full of mockery as he struggled to keep his balance. He didn't react. He simply crouched down, picked up the flag that had slipped from the door frame, and continued painting, one brushstroke at a time. They didn't know who he was, but someone watching from across the street did. And when the truth came out, the same man they had humiliated would stand before a crowd of people in silence as a sign of respect. The morning sun barely broke through the thick clouds hanging over Spokane, Washington, casting a pale gray light over the city's quiet rooftops. It was the kind of light that made everything look like an old photograph, soft, still, and worn. On South Madison Street, between a pawn shop with flickering neon and a tax office that hadn't updated its sign since 1994, stood the Lexington Theater. Once, it had been the pride of downtown Spokane, a place where velvet curtains rose to applause and orchestras filled the hall with life. Now, the windows were boarded, the marquee letters had long since fallen, and weeds grew up through the cracks in the brick facade. Still, every morning, a man showed up. Howard Finch, 78, arrived just before sunrise, moving slow but steady. He always wore the same canvas coat with elbow patches, the same soft wool cap, and a pair of worn leather gloves that looked older than the building itself. In one hand, a red metal toolbox. In the other, a folded American flag. He would quietly unlock the rusted side gate, slip through the alley beside the theater, and begin his day, unseen, unbothered, and mostly unacknowledged. To some, he was just that old guy downtown, the one who scraped off graffiti, swept the sidewalk, painted door frames, and trimmed back the ivy. No one had hired him. No one really understood why he did it. But he came anyway. Every day. Rain or shine. Even when the snow blanketed the sidewalks and the town was half shut down, Howard was there, broom in hand, head down, eyes quiet. The Lexington Theater, for him, was never truly abandoned. A few people noticed him, but only in passing. Mrs. Langley, a widow in her 80s, passed by each morning at exactly 7:10, her miniature Pomeranian yapping at Howard's boots. She would nod politely, and he would tip his cap in return. Officer Ray, the beat cop, would sometimes wave from across the street, his voice muffled by the steam of his coffee. "Morning, Mr. Finch," he'd say. Howard would lift a hand but rarely spoke back. Some days people whispered that he might be homeless, others assumed he had dementia, but nobody asked him. No one asked why he painted a building that was condemned, why he scrubbed brass handles that no one touched, why he hung a flag every morning beside a door that no one opened, why, even when the city announced the building would be demolished in the coming months, he kept showing up, as if it didn't matter. As if something deeper bound him to that place. That morning, Howard arrived just after 6 a.m. The sky was still a deep, bruised blue, and frost clung to the edges of the sidewalks like thin glass. His breath rose in soft clouds as he walked, toolbox in one hand, flag under his arm. The theater loomed ahead like an old shipwreck in a sea of cracked asphalt. Howard knelt on a folded blanket by the door, carefully unscrewing the rusted hinges on a loose panel. His hands were slow but practiced, his shoulders stiff but determined. The red metal paint glistened faintly under the dim streetlights. As he worked, the world around him began to stir. The bakery lights flickered on. A delivery truck rumbled past, scattering a flock of pigeons. The first few commuters hurried by, heads down, earbuds in, lost in their own lives. Howard hummed under his breath, a habit from long ago. The same tune he had hummed in jungles far from here, waiting in silence, hoping for dawn. Across the street, the door of Stanley's Hardware opened, and 3 men stepped out. Big men, loud, contractor types, mid-40s, work boots, heavy jackets. With company logos stitched across the chest, their names were Rick, Tom, and Dale. They crossed the street, coffee cups in hand, boots crunching on the frost. Look who's still at it, Rick muttered, elbowing Tom. Tom smirked. Old museum? Keeper's still alive, Dale chuckled, tilting his cup. Hey, Howard, you know they're tearing this place down next month, right? Howard glanced up, offering a faint nod before returning to his work. Rick wasn't satisfied. He stepped closer, coffee in one hand, smirk curling at the corner of his mouth. You trying to save it with a paintbrush, huh? Rick crouched slightly, voice dropping. You ever wonder if maybe it's time to hang it up, old man? Howard gently folded the cloth over the loosened hinge and pressed it into his toolbox. Tom joined in, hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. You hear they're putting in a parking lot here? Bet you could sweep that too. Laughter rippled between them. Howard rose slowly to his feet, brushing off his knees. His eyes, pale, steady, met Rick's for a brief moment. As they turned away, Rick's foot caught the edge of the toolbox, sending it toppling. Tools clattered onto the pavement, scattering like startled birds. The men didn't look back. For a long moment, Howard stood there in the cold, watching the wrench roll to the edge of the sidewalk. He let out a slow breath, bent down, picked it. Up, one by one, he gathered the scattered tools, brushing frost from the metal with his gloved hands. Across the street, Mrs. Langley paused on the sidewalk, watching from beneath her wool hat, her little dog silent for once. She didn't speak. She just watched. A block away, Officer Ray slowed his patrol car, his brow furrowing, but he didn't stop. Howard packed the last of the tools into the box, straightened his coat, and turned back to the door. Above him, the old theater sign creaked in the wind. The cold seeped into his bones, sharp and familiar, like an old companion he no longer feared. As the morning unfolded, Howard kept working, painting, scraping, polishing. That afternoon, as the sun sank behind the western hills and long shadows stretched over South Madison Street, Howard remained at the theater. The contractors were gone. The sidewalks had filled with the quiet bustle of small-town life. Mothers, herding children home from school, shopkeepers locking up, the bakery selling its last loaves for the day. Howard crouched near the entrance, his brushstrokes steady as he finished the last coat of red on the doorframe. His fingers were stiff from the cold, but he worked as if it didn't matter. As if the theater's crumbling bricks, the splintered wood, the tarnished handles, still deserved care. A soft voice called from behind. Mr. Finch? Howard turned. Casey, the young barista, stood a few feet away, clutching a paper bag. She shifted nervously from foot to foot, dark hair tucked behind one ear. I just got a sandwich and coffee. Thought maybe. Howard's face softened. He took a step forward, removing his cap. Thank you, miss, he said quietly, his voice raspy but warm. That's very kind. She smiled, cheeks flushing pink. You're welcome. As Casey disappeared around the corner, Howard sat on the low stone step beneath the theater's faded marquee. He opened the bag, unwrapped the sandwich, and took small, measured bites. His eyes drifted across the street, where Mrs. Langley's apartment window glowed softly, and further down, where Officer Ray's cruiser idled at the corner. For a long time, he just sat there, the cold settling deeper into his bones, the last of the daylight slipping away. And then, as if remembering something, he rose. He crossed to the alley beside the theater and disappeared into a narrow passage behind the building. There, beneath a tarp and an old wooden awning, was a small stack of folding chairs, rusted, bent, forgotten. One by one, Howard carried them out to the front sidewalk. It was nearly dark when Mrs. Langley emerged from her building, wrapped in a heavy coat, tugging her little dog along. She paused when she saw him. Howard lifted a hand. Evening, ma'am. She approached slowly, curiosity in her eyes. Mr. Finch, what are you doing with those old chairs? Howard smiled faintly. Tomorrow's Veterans Day, he murmured, adjusting one of the chair legs. Figured someone might want to sit. Mrs. Langley's expression softened, her hand resting briefly on his arm. "You're a good man, Howard." He gave a small nod, then bent to unfold another chair. Later that night, long after the streets had emptied and the last lights had flickered out, Howard remained on the sidewalk. He wiped down the brass handles on the theater doors. He adjusted the flag on its pole, and as the cold deepened, he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small, worn photo, not of himself alone, but of his entire unit, arms slung over shoulders, grinning in dusty fatigues. Howard closed his eyes. The jungle heat, the silence after the firefights. He tucked the photo back into his pocket, exhaling slowly into the night. Across the street, inside the bakery, a man in uniform was watching. His name was Lieutenant Mark. Callowell recently transferred to Spokane, and though Howard didn't know it, Callowell had already made a few calls. The morning of Veterans Day dawned cold and clear. A thin layer of snow dusted the sidewalks, sparkling under the pale November sun. Small American flags lined the main street, placed there by the city for the annual parade. Shop windows displayed red, white, and blue ribbons, and a stage had been set up at the square, where the mayor would deliver his usual speech. But on South Madison Street, Howard Finch was already at work. He had arrived before dawn, shoveling the thin snow from the sidewalk, brushing frost from the brass handles of the theater, and carefully setting out the old folding chairs he'd cleaned the night before. His movements were slower that morning, his breath heavier. Still, he moved with purpose. At 8 a.m., as the town slowly came to life, the contractors showed up again, Rick, Tom, and Dale. They were carrying coffee, laughing at something none of them would remember a week later. When they saw Howard, their grins sharpened. "Look at this," Rick muttered. The old museum keeper's at it again. Howard kept his eyes on the ground, adjusting the last chair. Howard turned slightly, offering a calm, steady look. "Just making sure people have a place to sit," he murmured. Rick's grin faded into something colder. With a sudden movement, Rick stepped forward and kicked the bucket of paint. The metal bucket rolled across the frozen sidewalk, splattering. Red paint over the snow. The sharp clang echoed down the street. Howard froze. The contractors burst into laughter, the sound harsh in the still morning air. From across the road, Mrs. Langley stood at her window, a hand pressed to the glass. Further down, Casey peeked from behind the bakery counter, eyes wide. But before anyone could speak, a low rumble filled the air. It started faintly, like the murmur of distant thunder, and then it grew louder. Engines, motorcycles, and SUVs from the far end of the street. A convoy rolled into view, gleaming motorcycles flying POW/MIA flags, black SUVs with veteran plates, pickup trucks lined with bumper stickers from every branch of the military. At the front, in a dark SUV, sat Lieutenant Mark Callowell. He stepped out, adjusting his uniform, eyes locked on Howard. The contractors turned, confused. What the hell? The convoy pulled to a stop. Doors opened. Men and women in uniform stepped out, some active duty, some long retired, all wearing the quiet, unmistakable bearing of those who had served. Callowell approached. "Mr. Finch," he said softly, with a nod of respect. Howard gave a faint, puzzled smile. "Morning, Lieutenant." The crowd that had gathered, drawn by the sound, the sight, the growing tension, watched in silence as Callowell reached into his coat and pulled out an old, worn photograph. He held it up. It showed Howard, 50 years younger, standing tall among his unit, helmet pushed back, hand resting on a comrade's shoulder, the unmistakable insignia of the 101st Airborne visible on his sleeve. "We've been looking for you, sir," Callowell said, "for a long time." Rick, Tom, and Dale stood frozen, their earlier bravado crumbling as murmurs rippled through the crowd. Casey stepped forward, blinking back tears. Callowell cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, his voice carrying down the street. "This man, This humble, quiet man you've all seen day after day is a decorated veteran of the Vietnam War. He served 3 combat tours. He was awarded the Bronze Star for valor. As the sun broke through the clouds, the townspeople began to gather. One by one, they approached, some with handshakes, some with quiet words, some with nothing but a touch on the shoulder. The 3 contractors slipped away, their laughter silenced. Howard stood in the center of it all, his cap pressed to his chest, eyes glistening. For the first time in years, the Lexington Theater echoed with applause. The sun hung low over Spokane, casting long amber streaks across South Madison Street. By late afternoon, the Lexington Theater, once a forgotten relic, had become the heart of the town. The folding chairs Howard had set out were now filled. Some with elderly veterans wearing caps embroidered with dates and battles, others with young families, children sitting cross-legged on the sidewalk, their eyes wide with curiosity. Flags waved gently in the breeze. Howard sat quietly on the edge of the crowd, his cap in his lap, watching as Lieutenant Callowell spoke at the temporary podium. Today, we remember not just a building, but the man who kept it alive. A man who, without fanfare or recognition, gave this community a gift, the gift of remembrance. The mayor approached the stage, adjusting his coat nervously. He cleared his throat. "Mr. Howard Finch," he said, reading from a small card. "In recognition of your service to this country and to this community, we hereby declare the Lexington Theater a historic site, preserved in honor of all who have served. And we name you its first honorary curator." The applause began slowly, then built into a rising wave, hands clapping, feet stomping on the pavement, cheers breaking through the November chill. Howard's eyes glistened. He rose carefully, knees stiff, and made his way to the stage with Callowell's help. For a long moment he stood there, looking out at the sea of faces. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, but carried through the cold air. "I'm no hero," Howard began, fingers trembling on the edge of the podium. "Never have been. I just took care of what was left." He paused, his gaze drifting over the crowd, landing briefly on Mrs. Langley, on Casey, on Officer Ray. "This building," he continued, voice roughened by emotion, "held memories, and memories matter. That's all I wanted to do, to keep them from fading." Howard took a small step back, lowering his head in thanks. Behind him, the mayor unfolded a deep blue velvet box, opening it to reveal Howard's long-lost bronze star, freshly polished, the engraved nameplate gleaming in the late sun. Howard froze, his breath caught. "It's yours, Howard," Callowell said quietly. "It was always yours." For a moment, the old soldier seemed smaller, more fragile. And then, as the applause rose again, as the townspeople rose to their feet, as children waved flags and veterans saluted, Howard straightened, just slightly, and let a small, quiet smile break across his face. That evening, long after the crowd had dispersed and the sun had slipped away, Howard sat alone on the steps of the theater. The chairs were folded, the banners taken down. The snow beginning to fall again, soft and slow. Casey brought him a thermos of coffee. Mrs. Langley walked her dog past one last time, giving a gentle wave. Officer Ray paused his patrol car just long enough to flash the lights in a silent salute. Howard sipped the coffee, letting the warmth seep into his fingers, and as the first snowflakes landed on the brim of his cap, he looked up at the old marquee, where the town had placed a new sign that afternoon: Lexington Veterans Memorial Theater, in honor of Howard Finch and all who served. If you enjoyed this story, click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story, especially for you.